Vladimir Bukovsky on Struggle for Peace as Russia's Foreign Policy Weapon. Excerpts from Peace as a Political Weapon, published by Ethics and Public Policy Center, Washington, D.C., 1987. Those who say that life is worth living at any cost have already written for themselves an epitaph of infamy, for there is no cause and no person that they will not betray to stay alive. Sidney Hook. No matter how much evidence is amassed of Soviet deception during the past 30 years, violation of international agreements, manipulation of public opinion, subversion and terrorism, covert coups and overt aggression, a large part of the Western public still finds it too difficult to accept. If nothing else, the sheer scope of this Soviet activity and the utterly inhuman methods they employ make a balanced Western observer suspicious. Even the most undeniable facts, like shooting down the Korean airliner or the invasion of Afghanistan, failed to change public opinion in the West. Instead, the very absurdity of Soviet behavior in both cases prompted many people to look for a more rational explanation of Soviet motives, or even for a justification. And more often than not, these explanations tend to blame the Western governments rather than the Soviets. Unfortunately, such an attitude is only natural. Any textbook of medical psychology describes a similar pattern of behavior displayed by a mother who lost her child, or by a patient with terminal cancer. In general, whenever a person is confronted with something mind-boggling, something utterly horrible and beyond his control, he goes through a succession of mental states ranging from denial to guilt, and from fantastic rationalization to acute depression. Indeed, what can be more traumatic than to face a mortal enemy who stops at nothing and who can destroy the earth 5 times over? An enemy who subjugates country after country slowly but steadily for half a century, who penetrates every sphere of our life and ruthlessly exploits our weakness, all for no apparent reason. In the course of history, we have tried practically every possible approach, from containment to détente, and nothing has worked. As Solzhenitsyn suggests, the Soviet spectre is like a cancer, and therefore, not surprisingly, our reaction to it is similar to that of a cancer patient. Soviet behavior, however, ceases to appear so frighteningly irrational and unbelievably cruel as soon as we understand that they regard themselves as being at war with the rest of the world. Basically, we accept different moral standards during wartime, and many acts of violence and deception appear justified. Thus, the sinking of the Lusitania by German U-boats in 1915 was probably a worse crime than shooting down a passenger airline in 1983, simply because the former incident killed at least 4 times as many innocent people, and because it occurred in neutral waters, while the latter occurred within Soviet airspace. Yet we are inclined to accept the sinking as legitimate, while the airline incident is viewed as a totally irrational and inexplicable act. Similarly, when we read about Lawrence of Arabia, we are not particularly outraged by his skillful manipulation of feuding Arab tribes, yet we refuse to believe that the Soviets routinely employ the same methods of warfare by supporting and manipulating all kinds of extremist groups around the world. The facts are undeniable, but it seems just too mean to be true. And speaking of propaganda, have deception or disinformation not always been legitimate means of war, from the Trojan horse to the fake D-Day assaults? Every country's army has a special detachment for psychological warfare, dormant in peacetime and activated at the beginning of hostilities. The only difference in the case of the Soviet Union is that the entire country became such a detachment, while the war itself was not formally declared. Strictly speaking, however, we cannot blame the Soviets even for waging an undeclared war against humanity. This war was actually proclaimed at turn of the century by the founders of Marxist-Leninist ideology under the banner of class struggle, and it continues unabated ever since. The idea of a permanent war against the non-communist world is the dominant feature of Soviet life, as in Nazi Germany, millions are brought up in the spirit of militarism and hatred, convinced by the pervasive propaganda that every foreigner is a spy, an enemy by definition. Just as one example of this massive militaristic upbringing, look at a copy of a popular Soviet magazine for preschool children, Veselye Kartinki, Merry Pictures. With a circulation of 9 million copies, it is dedicated to glorification of the military tradition, past and present, to praising the Soviet army in general and the border guards in particular, because they protect your peaceful and happy childhood. In the light of this, should we be surprised that the murder of some 300 people on a Korean airliner did not arouse popular indignation in the Soviet Union? Consistent with the state of permanent war is notorious Soviet secretiveness. Practically anything, from a small-scale map to a telephone directory, or from the production goals of a factory to statistics of accidents and natural disasters, is treated as an official secret. Recently, a new law was passed making it a criminal offence, punishable by 3 years in labour camps, to pass virtually any information to a foreigner or to any person who just might pass it to a foreigner. This new law, of course, does not apply to passing genuine military information, the penalty for which has been the firing squad. In fact, the Soviet system not only stresses secretiveness, but a deliberately cultivated paranoia, numerous TV series about foreign spies, endless films about World War II, persistent official appeals for vigilance, and artificially created international tensions. All these are designed to maintain a spirit of mobilization and virtually a state of martial law. Still, many thousands of those who visited the Soviet Union recently came out with the impression that the Soviets, whatever problems they might have, and who has no problems, are essentially just another country not too different from the rest of the world, and certainly do not want a war with anybody. Thus, the main goal of the Soviet disinformation is to conceal the fact of war waged by them against the non-communist world. As Dr. Goebbels, an early expert in the field, said, "A lie must be monstrous to be convincing." The Brainwashing Campaign. Robert Gillette, in his Los Angeles Times article, August 12, 1984, from Moscow, Soviets Show the Facade of Peace, describes in detail the massive brainwashing campaign. 2 centuries later, Pokazuka, the facade, is alive and well in Russia and an integral part of state propaganda. Its principal targets today are the growing numbers of American and West European peace activists who come here in organized tours to see for themselves whether the Soviet Union is, as it claims to be, a benign and peace-loving nation. Some return home discouraged by the heavy-handedness of Soviet propaganda and the inflexibility of officials who uniformly insist that American imperialism is the sole cause of tension in the world. But hundreds of others, whose fears of a nuclear holocaust seemingly predisposed them to take Soviet reassurances of goodwill at face value, come away from whirlwind tours with a glowing image of the country and its ambitions in the world arena that bears little resemblance to the Soviet Union familiar to the foreign scholars, diplomats, journalists, and businessmen who live here. Although their numbers are relatively small, the often bizarre image they carry away is amplified by the dozens of speeches many will deliver home to church and civic groups across the United States, with cumulative audiences numbering in the tens of thousands. Some Americans are surprised to see Russians on the streets behaving like ordinary people, chatting, often smiling, coddling their children. When these fleeting scenes of Soviet life fail to match up with the Orwellian image of a repressive state many Westerners bring with them, they conclude, with encouragement from their Soviet hosts, that the deception lies on the other side. The visitors' horizons are further limited by the fact that almost none of them speak Russian. Even those who do seem generally unaware that most Soviet citizens, when confronted by an unknown and inquisitive foreigner, find it best to respond with a faithful reproduction of Pravda, or the last obligatory political lecture he or she attended. End of quotation. The struggle for peace has always been a useful tool of Soviet foreign policy. Communists have always known very well that the majority of the population in any country of the world would accept their rule only as a last resort, only when the alternative would be absolutely unbearable. They are, therefore, very skillful in exploiting unbearable situations, or in creating them, as in Poland, and they are extremely clever at moulding political events to give the appearance that their rule is the only alternative. Thus, opponents appear to be unreasonable and enemies of peace, while the communists are the peacemakers. Besides, in the ideological struggle it is much more advantageous to be on the side of such noble causes as justice, peace, equality, a terminological game played by the Soviets to the point of perfection. So they are indeed peace lovers, if we are to accept their definition of peace. One can find plenty of examples in recent history to confirm the consistency of the Soviets' peaceful policy as described above. The creation of the Soviet Union itself out of the ashes of World War I and the turmoil of the subsequent Civil War, Moscow's love affair with Hitler, and the events during World War II. After the war, they touted the cause of peace while trying to catch up with the West in the nuclear arms race, and as a means to silence the public outcry over their occupation of Eastern Europe. And now, as they try to retain their nuclear superiority over the West, they use it again to silence the growing criticism of Soviet adventurism in the Third World and of human rights violations at home. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, they exploit the cause of peace to extend their political influence in Western Europe. Once again, political foes of the Soviet Union, this time the Western democracies, are defamed as unreasonable, as insane or as warmongers, just because they do not want to accept the lesser evil of Soviet domination as an alternative to the ultimate evil of nuclear holocaust. Also, contrary to the hysterical outcry of many anti-nuclear activists, I did not imply that the so-called peace movement consists exclusively of paid Soviet agents. In fact, in my view, the overwhelming majority of peace marchers are well-intentioned, albeit confused, naive and frightened people. As usual, there are plenty of professional political profiteers who seek popularity by jumping on the bandwagon of peace at any price, just as there are plenty of people who try to exploit the atmosphere of panic for their own selfish purposes. But there is also not the slightest doubt that this motley crowd is manipulated by a handful of activists instructed directly from Moscow. If we keep in mind that since 1977 the Soviets have been deploying SS-20s at a rate of 1 per week, we should have no difficulty in realizing how helpful a peace movement in Western Europe could be in thwarting Western efforts to match the Soviet nuclear arms build-up in kind. There was, moreover, the need to preclude Western criticism of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which occurred about the same time the Kremlin decided to become more involved in peace movements in the West. It was not difficult at the time for Soviets to imagine what the West's reaction to these moves would be. It may mean the end of détente, they probably thought, but they knew they could always resort to their traditional Cold War strategy of combining provocations with the ever-present Soviet struggle for peace. The Soviet use of the absolute value. The Soviets are extremely skilled at brainwashing people. One of their most successful tricks, the same one which is the very foundation of communist ideology, is to confront a human being with an absolute value. Thus, the Soviets tout an absolute and everlasting happiness for mankind as an irresistibly appealing ideal attainable only through communism. Similarly, the absolute and irreversible destruction of the entire globe, horrible as it is shown to be in numerous documentaries, is another absolute value, only this time an absolutely negative one. Relativism is a difficult concept to grasp, let alone to live with. Absolute value, on the other hand, whether positive or negative, saves us from the spiritual anguish of having to choose constantly between good and better, between bad and worse. But it also deprives us of our free will. It enslaves us. This subject is endless, and it is not my task here to plunge into an extended philosophical essay. But a comment is in order on the notorious decision by American Catholic bishops to declare that nuclear weapons are immoral. Christian morality is a foundation of our civilization, and no one should think for a moment that the bishops have a monopoly on it. In my understanding, the Christian doctrine rejects simple arithmetic in the question of morality. Human life is proclaimed to be priceless, and one life is deemed to be as priceless as a dozen lives. Then how can they calculate that nuclear war is immoral while conventional war is not? After all, the conventional World War II cost humanity some 50 million lives. Was it moral or immoral to defend ourselves against Hitler's aggression? As I have pointed out earlier, the absolute value deprives us of free will. As Sidney Hook quite rightly remarked, those who say that life is worth living at any cost have already written for themselves an epitaph of infamy, for there is no cause and no person that they will not betray to stay alive. Indeed, such endorsement of immorality is very strange to hear from God's shepherds, who, after all, should be more concerned with a man's soul than his survival. Be that as it may, in practice it was precisely the psychological lure of the absolute value that lay behind the stunning success of Soviet propaganda in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. In the name of the ultimate value, people were asked to betray their normal values. After sufficiently scaring them with the horrors of a possible nuclear holocaust, they were bluntly told that the West was pushing the world toward the edge of catastrophe by imposing economic sanctions on the Eastern Bloc and by boycotting cultural exchanges and sporting events, in response, of course, to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the persecution of scientists in the USSR. In order to diffuse the issue of human rights, which was clearly putting them on the defensive, the Soviets proclaimed a new slogan: "The people have the power to preserve peace, their main right." Thus, in pursuit of the ultimate right, the people were supposed to sacrifice all other rights, and they did. After all, who cares how many are arrested, tortured, or killed by the Soviets when the main task is to save humanity from destruction? Not surprisingly, nobody asked the Soviets the most obvious questions. If you are as anxious to avoid a Holocaust as you say, why should you continue to oppress your own people and others? Why should you remain in Afghanistan? Why should you not simply disarm unilaterally as you require us to do? No, nobody asked those questions because the Soviets are known to be impossible, while the West is known to be only unreasonable and often amenable to pressure. Soviet influence over the peace movement. Once again, this time through the peace movement, Soviet propaganda has managed to hoodwink a considerable number of people in the West. After taking a spiritual lead over the movement, it was not very difficult to take an organizational one. After all, if we are to accept the peace at any price philosophy, we must all unite, irrespective of our past crimes, political differences, and beliefs, in order to survive. What these multitudes of inspired people apparently do not know is that communists are incapable of normal human cooperation. They are either your enemies or they rule you. Most importantly, the issues of peace and the arms race should be returned to the natural context of East-West relations, with public attention being constantly redirected to Soviet intentions instead of the sheer amount of weapons accumulated by both sides. Paradoxically, the best Western position was formulated long before the peace movement became an issue. It is the Helsinki Accords, signed in 1975 by 35 countries of Europe, Canada, and the United States, which links respect for human rights with the problems of security. All the West needed to counter the Soviet peace campaign of the past 4 years was to return to this formula, conveniently endorsed by the signature of Brezhnev and other East European rulers. The logic of this position is impeccable. How can we control the arms race without verification, and how can we achieve verification without mutual trust? For that matter, how can anyone trust a government that does not allow its people to know the truth and discuss it, and that deliberately instills hostility and hatred toward other nations into the minds of its population? How can we build trust with a nation whose citizens are not allowed to have a sincere and open dialogue with foreigners, under threat of imprisonment? As Andrei Sakharov, the only Russian ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, writes, "As long as a country has no civil liberty, no freedom of information, and no independent press, then there exists no effective body of public opinion to control the conduct of government." Meanwhile, the Soviet military-industrial complex and the KGB are gaining in strength, threatening the stability of the entire world, and supermilitarization is eating up all our resources. A most important concept, which in time became a cornerstone of my position, writes Sakharov in his letter to Anatoly Alexandrov, president of the USSR Academy of Sciences, is the indissoluble bond between international security and trust on the one hand, and respect for human rights and an open society on the other. Ironically, this clear position could easily become a basis for the long-coveted bipartisan foreign policy in America, if any administration ever tried to offer it. In his special appeal for Peace Day, Governor Mario Cuomo, who can hardly be described as a conservative hardliner, states, "The risk of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union can be reduced if all people can express their opinions freely and without fear on domestic and world issues, including their nation's arms policies." The Soviet Union is a signatory of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations as signed 36 years ago. The Soviet Union is also a signatory of the Helsinki Agreements, which promised the facilitation of travel, uninhibited exchange of information, reunification of families, review of applications for visas, and the right of all people to enjoy personal and religious freedom. International tension will be lessened and international stability enhanced through complete acceptance and implementation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations and the Helsinki Agreements by all signatories. End of quotation. But more importantly, entering into arms negotiations with the Soviet Union means that the West has essentially accepted the Soviet proposition that the main threat in the world today comes from bombs and missiles, and not from the Soviet system itself. In other words, it has amounted to an acceptance of the notion that disarmament can be discussed outside the context of East-West relations. All in all, it was an unbelievably inconsistent and irresponsible political decision. As a result, the United States has appeared to be weak, frightened, and under constant pressure. Once again, the Soviets have scored a propaganda victory and forced the West into a defensive position, and they did this at a time when they were vulnerable, at a time when they had been caught cheating on arms control agreements and the Helsinki Accords, above all after having committed outright aggression in Afghanistan. Conclusion. It seems that we will continue to squander billions of dollars in an endless arms race. We will continue to fight communism on the outskirts of our countries, but each time closer and closer to our homes. We will continue to deceive ourselves with the expectations that a closet liberal will somehow manage to make his way to the top of the Soviet ruling circles, or that the communist dictatorship will somehow be overthrown by a military coup. We will continue business as usual with Moscow, and lively hope for the best.